She has 12 days to become a competitor again. Right now, she is something else entirely. She is a nation's answer to a question it has been asking for 100 years. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a shopping mall in Makati is about to become the loudest room in professional tennis. Two people matter in this story, and only one of them knows it yet. The first is a 21-year-old left-handed tennis player from Quezon City who just spent 2 weeks proving she belongs on the biggest stages in the sport. The second is a telecommunications company that has been quietly building a stage of its own, waiting for the exact right moment to fill it. Those two forces are about to collide in an atrium in Makati City, and the collision is not going to look like triumph. It is going to look like something far more complicated. Why? Because the biggest celebration of her career is happening before she has had a single day to process her biggest heartbreak. Keep that tension in mind, because it explains everything that follows. Picture this: London, Wimbledon, a fourth-round match against a player who simply would not go away. She claws her way into a third set. She takes a set lead into the decider. She is one break away from the biggest win of her life, one match away from a place in the tennis history books nobody from her country has ever reached. And then it slips. 6 games to 3. Match over. She walks off center court, and instead of a trophy, she carries a version of heartbreak that has no easy name. The specific kind that comes from being so close you could touch it. Now rewind further, because this moment did not appear out of nowhere. Go back to when she was a kid in Quezon City, hitting balls against a wall, telling anyone who would listen that her idol was a Russian teenager who had already won Wimbledon before she could legally drive. That teenager's name was Maria Sharapova. For years, that connection was just a nice story, a young player naming her hero. Nobody could have guessed it would eventually become the headline of her breakout month, but it did. Stick with this, because that idol is about to reappear in a way nobody expected. Ask yourself this: how does a fourth-round loss at Wimbledon turn into the single biggest homecoming event of someone's career within 9 days? That is not a normal timeline. That is a machine moving at a speed that only makes sense if the machine was already built and waiting. To understand why that machine existed at all, you have to go back further than this single Wimbledon run. Years before any of this, she was just another talented junior working her way up through the sport's lower levels. Long qualifying draws, small-town tournaments, matches that started at hours nobody outside her immediate circle was awake to watch. Long before international broadcasters knew her name, a small but fiercely loyal group of fans back home had already decided she was worth staying up for. They watched her grind through smaller European events. They followed her march through a WTA 125 title. They noticed every incremental jump in ranking long before any of it turned into a headline. That patience matters, because it is the exact foundation the sudden explosion of attention was eventually built on top of. So let's go back to where this really starts, because the story does not begin with the loss. It begins 2 days earlier, on center court in a match that had nothing to do with heartbreak at all. This is where a rising Filipina player became something the sport could no longer treat as a surprise. She walked onto court against the defending Wimbledon champion, a player who had lifted that same trophy the year before. And she did not play like an underdog. She played like someone who belonged there. The match swung back and forth. Tie-break in the first set, a tighter finish in the second, and when it was over, the 21-year-old from Quezon City had done something no Filipino tennis player had ever managed at this level. She had beaten a reigning Grand Slam champion at the tournament that champion had just won. Think about the weight sitting inside that single result. This was not a lower-tier event where an upset barely registers outside the sport's inner circle. This was the tournament with the most history behind it, against an opponent who had won the exact same title 12 months earlier. Every commentator watching that match understood in real time that they were not just watching a good day at the office, they were watching a career shift gears in front of them. The reaction was almost instant, and it did not come from anonymous fan accounts. It came from tennis royalty. Within hours, a 5-time Grand Slam champion and former world number 1 posted 2 words about her on social media, calling her a star. If you know anything about how rarely established champions publicly anoint the next generation, you know that is not just encouragement, that is closer to a passing of a torch. And remember who that former champion was. It was the exact player this 21-year-old had spent her childhood idolizing. Imagine growing up pointing at someone's poster on your wall, then having that same person publicly declare you the real deal the moment you arrive. That is not a coincidence the internet can shrug off. That is a lineage being acknowledged in real time. It did not stop there. A tennis legend widely credited with transforming the sport for women made a point of meeting her in person, specifically referencing the pride of her home country. Even further up the ladder of visibility, a member of the British royal family posed for a photograph with her courtside, an image that circulated across international outlets within the day. In the span of one afternoon, she went from being a name tennis insiders tracked closely to a name casual sports fans across multiple continents suddenly recognized. But here's what makes this more than a single viral afternoon. This was not an isolated spike. Rewind through her season and you'll see a pattern building for months. A strong run in Miami earlier in the year, a semifinal in Berlin after upsetting 2 well-known, higher-ranked opponents back-to-back, a title run at a WTA 125 event in Birmingham, and now this, a 4th-round appearance and a statement win over a reigning major champion at the most famous tournament in the sport. That is not luck showing up once. That is a curve, and every brand, every sponsor, every corporate partner attached to her name was suddenly scrambling to catch up to where that curve was heading. Now here's where the story turns, because 2 days after that career-defining win came the moment that actually broke hearts back home, the very tension we opened with. She met a determined opponent in the 4th round and could not finish the job. 2 sets played out, and in the decider, her opponent closed it out comfortably. Just like that, the tournament that had elevated her into a completely different tier of recognition also ended her run there, only 48 hours after the biggest win of her career. Talk about whiplash. One day, she is receiving the kind of validation athletes wait entire careers for. 2 days later, she is packing her bags out of the same tournament, the loss stinging in a way that no headline about her global rise could soften. How do you even process something like that? The internet was not shy about weighing in, but her own response told you everything about who she actually is. She did not go on social media to relitigate the match or promise revenge. Instead, on July 7th, 2 days after the loss, she opened her account and posted a message of gratitude, not to a coach, not to a sponsor, but to the Filipino fans who had packed the stands in London, waving their flags for her through every round. Fans across timelines everywhere, the ones who had stayed up until 3 in the morning to watch her play smaller tournaments long before Wimbledon ever noticed her, immediately picked up on the significance of that gesture. This was not a manufactured moment for engagement. This was someone processing grief by turning toward the people who had shown up for her longest. You would think that after a loss like that, the next few weeks would be quiet. A little rest, a little recalibration, maybe a low-key trip home before the next tournament. That is not what happened. Just 2 days after her gratitude post, a mere 72 hours after the loss itself, a telecommunications company back home made an announcement that changed the entire shape of her homecoming. They revealed a public event, a meet-and-greet experience, open to fans, gated only through a company app, set to take place at a mall activity center in Makati City. Free to attend, registration in the afternoon, program starting at 6 in the evening. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because the speed of that announcement only makes sense one way. 2 working days is not enough time to plan a public event of that scale from scratch. The venue booking, the security coordination, the marketing rollout across every platform. That timeline only works if the plan was already built and sitting ready, waiting for the exact moment her tournament run ended, win or lose. This was not a spontaneous celebration. This was a contingency plan finally getting triggered. And look closer at what changed compared to the last time this same company hosted her. A year earlier, in the middle of last year, they held a similar meet with her at their own corporate tower, an invite-only, controlled corporate environment. This time, 12 months later, they moved the entire event into a public mall atrium in one of the busiest commercial districts in Metro Manila. That is not a minor scheduling choice. That is a company placing a very public, very expensive bet that a national audience will show up in numbers big enough to justify opening the doors to literally anyone who can download an app. Speaking of that app, every single attendee has to register through the company's own mobile application to secure a spot. Think about what that actually means from a business perspective. A telecom provider just turned a fan gathering into a customer funnel because the demand around one athlete has become large enough to double as an acquisition tool. That is what it looks like when a fan base stops being just a fan base and starts being treated as commercial infrastructure. Put yourself in the room where that decision actually got made. Somebody at that company had to look at the numbers, engagement on her social posts, search interest spiking after every match, ticket and merchandise inquiries pouring in, and conclude that a public mall event carried less risk than the upside of turning thousands of new app downloads into paying customers. That is not cynicism on the company's part. That is simply what happens whenever a single athlete's popularity crosses a threshold big enough to become a marketing channel in its own right. And once you see that threshold get crossed, you start to realize just how large her following back home had quietly become before the rest of the world caught up to it. And look closer at what changed compared to the last time this same company hosted her. A year earlier, in the middle of last year, they held a similar meet with her at their own corporate tower, an invite-only, controlled corporate environment. This time, 12 months later, they moved the entire event into a public mall atrium in one of the busiest commercial districts in Metro Manila. That is not a minor scheduling choice. That is a company placing a very public, very expensive bet that a national audience will show up in numbers big enough to justify opening the doors to literally anyone who can download an app. Speaking of that app, every single attendee has to register through the company's own mobile application to secure a spot. Think about what that actually means from a business perspective. A telecom provider just turned a fan gathering into a customer funnel because the demand around one athlete has become large enough to double as an acquisition tool. That is what it looks like when a fan base stops being just a fan base and starts being treated as commercial infrastructure. Put yourself in the room where that decision actually got made. Somebody at that company had to look at the numbers, engagement on her social posts, search interest spiking after every match, ticket and merchandise inquiries pouring in, and conclude that a public mall event carried less risk than the upside of turning thousands of new app downloads into paying customers. That is not cynicism on the company's part. That is simply what happens whenever a single athlete's popularity crosses a threshold big enough to become a marketing channel in its own right. And once you see that threshold get crossed, you start to realize just how large her following back home had quietly become before the rest of the world caught up to it. So here's what this all actually means when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. The Philippines has produced global champions in boxing, in billiards, in volleyball, but never before at the top level of tennis, not until this month. There's a phrase that used to be reserved for exactly one athlete at the peak of his career, a phrase that basically functioned as a national title of its own. That phrase is quietly being transferred to a 21-year-old left-hander, and a public corporate event in a mall atrium is simply the visible commercial version of a transfer that has already happened in the hearts of an entire fan base. The Sharapova comment, the Billie Jean King meeting, the royal photograph, the move from a private corporate tower to a public street-level mall, every single one of those data points points toward the exact same conclusion. She has crossed over from a promising athlete to a genuinely global figure, and her own country is finally being given permission to celebrate that at full volume. This is bigger than one athlete having a good month. Think about what it means for a country to go generations without a tennis star who can compete at this level, and then suddenly have one arrive who is not just competitive, but actively being endorsed by the exact legends the sport reveres most. That kind of validation reshapes how an entire nation of young athletes sees what is possible for them. Every kid currently hitting a ball against a wall somewhere in the provinces, the way she once did, now has proof that the path from there to center court is not theoretical. It has already been walked, once by someone who looks like them and sounds like them. That is the part of this story that outlasts any single mall event, the ceiling that just got raised for everyone coming up behind her. What happens after this one evening in Makati matters just as much as the evening itself. From there, she heads to Washington, then to Cincinnati, then to the Canadian Open in Toronto, then to the US Open at the end of August. 4 tournaments in 5 weeks, every one of them now being watched by a fan base that grew by an entire order of magnitude in a single afternoon on center court. One sports outlet already put it plainly. She has become one of the biggest draws in the entire sport. A mall atrium in Makati is likely going to be the smallest room she ever plays in again. Everything after this is arenas. So here's the question worth leaving you with. When she takes that microphone at 6 o'clock and looks out at a room full of people who have followed her since long before any of this started, what do you think she should say to them? And does this Makati homecoming even come close to topping her earlier appearance back home in January? Or is the real biggest moment of this entire run still somewhere ahead of her? Drop your answer below, and if you want to be in the room for every step of what comes next, from that mall atrium all the way to Flushing Meadows, make sure you're subscribed, because we are covering all of it.